So sign in with Apple, they announced it at WWDC this past year. It's pretty awesome. It's going to make signing in much better. They kind of glossed over a few points, though. You know, they kept harping on how easy it is to implement, and it is, as long as you understand some of the little gotchas that we'll talk about today. But in general, these are all the reasons that you want to implement it. It makes things easier for your end users when they're trying to sign in, because they're pretty much just sort of clicking a button and then either using their thumb or the Face ID, and they get in. They don't have to answer a bunch of questions. You're not having to write registration forms. Everybody's just happier. It does work with both mobile and the web. I'm only going to really discuss mobile today. The web is done through JavaScript and some other evil mechanisms. So there are just a couple things you need to be careful about when you do it. It is still a little bit buggy, especially in the simulator. You'll sometimes just get weird crashes, or it won't pop up the window even though it should. There's no great solution other than reboot. Sometimes I've had to reinstall. It's new technology. On the device, it does work pretty well. The biggest one that, there's a ton of tutorials out there. You've probably all seen one of these before. They all sort of gloss over the fact that if you request the name and email address of the user, Apple will only give it to you one time. Not sure the rationalization behind that, but that means you've got to account for that if anything goes wrong, and we'll get into exactly how to deal with that issue. It does, of course, require iOS 13. There's not a lot of adoption yet, unfortunately, but in reality, if you've got an app, add it in, right? Even if you're still supporting, iOS 9, just do the checks, the runtime checks, the compile checks, see is it available, and if so, pop this up instead of whatever your current login mechanism is. And then the last one's just kind of a political Apple thing, right? If you support sign-in with anyone, right, Google, Facebook, whatever, Apple is going to start requiring that you also implement sign-in with Apple, and they will require that you put theirs first. So, if you submit your app to the App Store and you've got sign in with Facebook, sign in with Apple, sign in with Google, supposedly they're going to reject you and tell you move their button up top. So hopefully Google and Facebook don't come out with similar rules, because then we got a problem. Okay, so the very first thing you need to do is what you're absolutely going to forget. I've done it so many times trying to make slides and stuff for this. You do need to add a capability to Xcode, which is just, you go in the project, signing in capabilities, and you say add sign in with Apple. If you don't do that, it's just confusingly not going to work, and you'll spin your wheels for a while trying to figure out what's going on. Optionally, that you'll probably want to support, Apple has a concept of associated domains. And so if your app also has a website presence where you let them go there and they log in with an iCloud name and password, for example, you can set it up so that Apple knows how to link your app with that, and sign in with Apple can also work with that. And so again, your users aren't having to rethink about passwords. They've already got it here. So originally, of course, they announced this at WWDC. At the same time, they announced SwiftUI, and we all ran down there to try and figure it out, and we went, wait, why doesn't this work with SwiftUI? When they developed this, they did not yet create a native control for sign-in with Apple in SwiftUI, and you have to do that yourself. It's not that hard. It's just very confusing. We all spent a lot of hours down in the labs with the Apple engineers, figuring out how to make it work. It is very easy to wrap yourself, but in the end, you want some type of screen like this, where you've got that nice, bad font, sign in with Apple button, and instead of having to type a name and password, you just tap that, do your Face ID, and boom, you're now in and registered with your app. Why did that not move? There we go. Okay, so Apple loves long names, right? We all know that. So this is just boilerplate code for the way that they have you interact between UIKit and SwiftUI. And so in this case, we're basically saying we want to create one of these AS authorization Apple ID buttons. when Swift tries to create this control. And there's a lot you can do with the UI view representable. Paul's over here, he's happy to tell you about it. But in general, when your view tries to instantiate, it's going to call this make UI view. That has to create and do whatever setup you want for your UI kit view and return that. So all we're doing here is just calling the constructor and returning it. And you'll notice I have no return keyword here, right? This is a feature they just kind of slipped into Swift 5.1. If your routine has just a single statement, you don't need the return keyword. And they did this specifically for SwiftUI because it makes it much cleaner when you're doing your the body variable. You know, and you've got all that nesting. You don't want to see return, 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 return. So take advantage of it in your code. Just be sure you check with your teammates. This is kind of already starting a bunch of battles in Slack channels, like should you or should you not have the return keyword? You know, make your policies. Because we're not actually making any changes to the button, the view, the update UI view is just blank. It's part of the protocol though, so it has to be there. So at that point, it's a real Swift UI view now, right? So in your body, where you're creating all of your interface, you just call sign in with Apple, and now you've got that view, and then you do everything else like you normally would. You know, set your frames, do your on-tap gestures. I will point out I'm really bad at SwiftUI. I haven't spent much time. That's probably not the best way to do your framing. But I put it there specifically because Apple does say in their documentation, don't make the button smaller than 280 by 60. So, you know, however you're dealing with your constraints, just make sure it's at least that big. Okay, so when you're ready to start using it, all you have to do is call this long ID provider create request. That gives you the elements that you need to pop up the dialog. You then have this optional request scopes where this is where you can tell what you want the user to provide you to then send back to your server. Today, I believe still the only two you can ask for are full name and email. Don't do this unless you have to. Right? This is kind of the big harping point that they were really making at WWDC. You know, it's really annoying when you get your brand new app and it pops up your screen and it says, what's your name, what's your email, what's your phone number? Like, really, do you need this to work with the app? So today you're probably asking for their email because you're using that as their login, right? The unique way you're identifying them in your database, for example. Sign in with Apple is going to give you that unique identifier to use. So unless you absolutely have to send emails to your customers, don't ask for their email, right? They're going to be happier, they don't have to give it. Same with the full name, right? If you're just asking for the name so that on your screen you can say, hi, Scott, you know, do you really need to bother doing that? Just let them get in without providing a bunch of personal data. So when it comes back, right, once you have authenticated and the sign-in says, yes, you're really you, what you're going to get back is one of these long things, right? Again, with the long Apple names. This is where you get all the credentials back, where Apple said, you are you, and this is the data about you. The most important thing here is they give you a unique ID, and that's the identifier that you should use on your backend server to represent that user. And the great thing they've done is they've guaranteed that every single app you have that's part of your same team ID, they will give you that exact same identifier. So for a lot of people, this doesn't matter so much, but if your company provides a suite of apps, you're going to have that same identifier in each one, and this allows you to ask for even less information. You know, if I download the first app you have, I sign in and I say, okay, here's my name and email, and then later I give you my address because you're going to ship me something. You've probably stored my address in your database. When I get your second app, you log me in and you go, oh, there's my identifier. Just pull my address in, right? So now the first time that I ask you to ship me something in that app, you've already got it. You pop up your form pre-filled out, and you just say, is this still your current address? Right? It saves them all that time of having to re-enter data. If you did ask for it on the previous code, you'll get your name and ID. Again, I'm going to keep harping on this point. You'll get it one time. The very first time that they successfully authenticate, Apple will give you either of those pieces of data which you asked for. The next two pieces it gives you are the identity token and the authorization code. So the identity token is how you're going to identify yourself to your server. So if you're just working locally on your app, you don't have any kind of backend database, you're just using the sign-in to make sure they can't get into your secret data, you don't need to bother with these at all. But if you're going to store something in your database, this is basically a JWT token that you'll send to your server, and then it will authenticate against Apple with it. And I'll show that at the very end of the talk. And then finally, they do give you an authorization code. They do some of an OAuth flow here. This really isn't used for anything today. It's just kind of, I think they did it for future proofing, so you have it and you consider it on your apps. So the big reason that I keep harping on this, the name and email, is what happens when something goes wrong, right? And so when you first start doing this, you assume, well, I know I'm on the network and I know everything worked because I signed in and Apple said, yeah, you're you. But the problem is now when you turn around and you want to go register with your database, something might go wrong there, right? Like some of you have seen in here, I'm sure today, the network will periodically drop out and you got to wait and get back on. So if Apple gives you the name and then you go to register with your server and it fails because your database is down or the network dropped, the next time you try and authenticate, it's not going to give you that anymore and you've lost that. So I'm now going to jump over to Xcode, and I'm sorry, I didn't plan this well, so I'm doing kind of some screen hopping here. Okay, so this is a method I've created for you have done your sign-in, you authenticated, Apple said you are you, and now you're going to register with your backend server. And this is basically how I fix the problem of losing it. So in this credential that they give you, you've got the email, the full name, and the user. And remember, email and full name are optionals, right? You might not have asked for them. If you did ask for them, you might not have gotten it, right? Something could have gone wrong there. So I just create a simple user data struct, and I hold that data, and then go into your keychain. Right? There's lots of ways you could solve this. I decided to just do it in the keychain, so it was kind of Swiftish and simpler. And so I take that user data and I store it into the keychain. And if for some reason I couldn't, we call our delegate and say, no, the sign-in failed, something went wrong. So now, when you pull out that identity token and your authorization and you call your register method, you succeed or fail. But if you failed for some reason, the next time you try and sign in, it's going to know you need to register, and now you can query your the keychain, right? If you haven't stored that somewhere, now you're in a situation where you're going to get a support ticket, and you're going to have to explain to them how to go into the settings on the iPhone and down into where they've buried sign in with Apple to say, forget about my app, so that it does come back again and ask you to register and get that data. Similarly, if you've already registered, then you're going to have a sign-in with an existing account, right? And so this time, instead of register, you're just going to call login and pass the credentials along. And then you've got basically one of three cases for the return type, right? Either your server is going to say, I can't log you in, you're not registered. In this case, you've got that keychain data now. You can query that out and then circle back and re-perform your registration. You might need to pop up a new form. It may just be on the back end. You can send your web request across, but you're not then involved with, well, shoot, I need his email and I don't know what it is. On success, right, do awesome things. Fail, you would have to kind of determine here, well, what does a failed login mean? If I logged in via sign-in with Apple, I know my password, right, is right that you don't have anymore, but you would have different types of cases here that you would want to work with. And so this is, of course, all implemented as a delegate. Once you've signed in, Apple's going to call this, did complete with authorization. There's a couple others, right? There's one for a failure, this kind of thing. And so you're going to take the authorization they send you, and you're going to try and cast it to the Apple ID credential. And in that case, it basically means you did the normal kind of sign in by doing a fingerprint or a thumb ID. And so what I've opted to do here, because in this app I did want email and full name, I basically said, if I got them, well, that means this is the first time that I've run this app, and so I'm going to call my registration code. If I didn't get a name and email, I've authenticated before with this, so I'm just going to do my existing sign-in. Right? So this part is obviously going to be custom logic for you to deal with the different pieces to know whether you're registering or not. But the key point is you've got to take that credential and see if it is the Apple ID. Because there is another one that we'll get to in a minute. So now I'm going to attempt to go back to presentation mode. There we go, that worked. Okay, so let's assume you've done all this, right? You've implemented all the code, you're ready to go. You probably need to make some changes on your back end because you're currently using email address, for example, as the primary key. So the simplest way around this is just add another column to your user table or your registration table, whatever that might be in your database, and have it to specifically hold the Apple ID identifier. And if you're already using something like sign in with Google or sign in with Facebook, you've probably done the similar thing. I'd assume you're not stuffing all your different types of IDs in one column. You've got a column for each type. And then, again, depending on your business logic, you're probably, when you try and authenticate, you're going to look in that Apple ID column first. If you match, there's your user. If not, now you might fall back to email or something else to find out which person has authenticated. And then just as a nicety, a neat suggestion I saw on the web is, consider building some kind of UI into your app once you add sign in with Apple to it to allow your users to associate their current account to that. Right? So if I'm currently signing in today with my email address, and now you push a new version that has sign in with Apple, once they've signed in, see that and say, oh, would you like to associate these two? And then do whatever on your back end. Maybe you remove their email at that point because you don't want to have that hangover, but potentially give them a way to link to all the rest of the apps that your company provides. So associated domains, this is something probably a lot of people aren't using, but I mentioned at the start that if you do have a web presence, you can create a file with this JSON code. They've basically made this .well-known directory. A bunch of vendors are starting to use this where they'll say, create that directory at the root of your website, and we'll look for a specific file at that specific path. So Apple's done this as well. If you create the Apple App Site Association, and you can't use an extension, so don't call it .json, this is where you can tell it for this website, what apps do you have that share credentials? And all you're doing here, is putting your bundle identifier, basically, your team ID and your reverse style domain. And this is how, when you've logged into your website, it knows to take your username and password and store it in your iCloud credentials. Sign in with Apple is also then able to look at those credentials and pull those out when you try and authenticate. This is another one of those caveats there that I'm sure will be fixed eventually. When I was playing with this, though, and using the associated domain, I was pointing at my one kind of Mongo site that I use for everything. Right? And so in my iCloud keychain there, I had like a myPHPadmin authorization. I had 4 or 5 different things against my account for the cloud. When sign in with Apple pops up, it doesn't scroll. So you're only going to see the first 2 or 3 accounts you have there and then not move on. And so, be sure that you don't have just one site for every app. Either it's going to need a subdomain, or you're going to want to make sure you have different logins for each one. So I'm going to hop back to Xcode. So this is the body, right, of my view. You can see down here where I've got the sign in with Apple. You can add this on appear, which is kind of like the view did appear from UIKit. And then I call this perform existing account setup flows. So this is kind of nice that if they come to this authentication screen, and that's your primary intent is they're going to push this button, call it for them. The trick here is it doesn't work in the simulator, right? So wrap it with this if not target environment simulator. When it first came out, there were tons of posts on the net saying, I'm getting this error code. What does it mean? I can't find anything. And it was basically Apple's cryptic way of saying, doesn't work in the simulator. But essentially, in this case, you're going to ask for the Apple ID provider and the password provider. And the password provider is the iCloud one. And so now when it pops up, it can figure out, do you already have an account in iCloud keychain for this, or should I ask you for the data? So at that point, now you're going to perform your sign-in, right? So you've got some kind of delegate you've set up, right? This had the other code that I've shown you already. And you're going to have a callback, right? Did it succeed or did it fail authenticating you? Take appropriate action here. This AS authorization controller is the actual thing that Apple has that pops up the little green sign in with Apple. You set the delegate on it and you call perform requests. And this little bit is what displays that dialog for you. Sorry, I didn't plan for the swapping back and forth when I was creating this presentation. So at a high level, that's really all it takes to add sign in with Apple to your code. You can see lots of examples out there. The documentation's pretty good. It's just a little unclear on some of the points right now. But when you look at everything out there, including what Apple kept showing at WWDC, they're always showing that second delegate, which is returning a window, right? It wants to know where you're presenting it. The main thing to remember here is you don't need to do that, right? All the samples do it. There's no point unless you're actually using multiple windows in your app. And I think that's probably a very, very small amount of people who create another window versus views within the existing window. So don't implement that delegate unless you need to. But if you do, then you're into a little bit of a trickier situation because now you need to use the environment. So let me switch again. So this is kind of what they expect, right? You have this amazingly clear type that you return. And all this has to do, even though it returns this ASP presentation anchor, what that really means is give me a window. And again, if you prefer, right, that can just say window because this is the only statement. You can see where there's going to be arguments about should you or should you not have the return keyword. What's tricky here is in SwiftUI, you don't really have a window easily because you've got a scene. And it's not quite as easy, as far as I know, to get the scene as it is to get your app delegate. And so you start playing some games here. So this, it's boilerplate code. It's a little confusing. This is actually when I was down in the lab, the Apple engineer doing sign in with Apple wrote this for me as, hey, here's how you should do it. Basically what you're doing is, you've seen in some of the other talks so far, the environment. Paul this morning was talking about it's a big singleton, right? But it stores the different pieces of information that are going to automatically be passed into your view. And so this setup is what essentially lets you say that in the environment, I'm going to create a key, an enum called window, and I'm going to store a UI window optional in that value. So then, so now in your content view, you basically tell it, hey, when this view comes up, go out to the environment, look up that window key that we just defined, and assign my window to that optional variable. And then, sorry, there's one more piece here I'm forgetting. That's right, scene delegate. Now in your scene delegate, which is very similar to the app delegate startup, after you've created the window and you instantiate your content view, you then call the .environment to put this window that you just created into that view. So now it's accessible, you can pass it around, you can return the view if you need it. Some people have asked, well, why to go all to this trouble? Why not just directly pass it in as a parameter? But you probably don't want to do that because if you're going to this trouble, you probably have multiple windows, and so now it doesn't make sense just to directly pass it. You need to pick and figure out which one it's going to be. So that's basically all the client side, right? Again, not a lot that goes in there. It's pretty quick to do. Server side, there's not a lot out there on this right now. I'm actually kind of working with the Vapor team on a Vapor community module for sign-in with Apple to handle the server side. The majority of the server side is only going to be relevant if you are implementing sign-in with Apple on your website, because that JavaScript from the website will need to hit your server to go out to Apple and do that authentication. But the general workflow here is actually quite a bit easier than I originally thought. When you get that identity token back from your credential, you're going to pass that to your server, and it's simply a JWT, right, a Java Web Token. You'll contact Apple, and they give you a JWKS, which is basically a signing key. You download that from them on each call. You then use that to figure out if the JWT passed in is valid. And if it is, now you know that that user is authenticated. The kind of quirk here, though, is that token that they give you to validate is only good for about 9 minutes. You can't change that. And this is where it goes to it's not quite the OAuth flow, it's just parts of it. At this point, and many thanks to Tim Condon for explaining this to me, you now need to create some way to pass back to your client what you want to use for authenticating afterwards. Because Apple doesn't want you to use their token with an hour-long expiration, because now you've built your whole backend around Apple. And what happens if they signed in with Google instead or with Facebook instead, right? So you just use the bits Apple gives you to say to your server, I really am me and this is the account I'm on. And now your server handles authorization and authentication however it wants, right? You'll probably create your own JWT, you'll give that to the client, and then on the subsequent calls that they make to your REST API, they would pass that along. And that is the talk. I think I'm pretty early.
Thanks, Scott. There are 3 questions on the pigeonhole.
I'll fake an answer. So the first question is, what's the Android story with sign-in with Apple? Will there be an Android SDK? What's Android? The actual answer is yeah, because you could use the web type stuff, right? You could hit just the straight Apple API calls. It'd be ugly and a hack, but I'm sure eventually somebody in the Android community is going to provide an actual framework to do it, and then I'm sure Apple will immediately do something to break that. It's a good game. How to make sign-in button react to the dark light color scheme without using if-else environment color scheme. I have no idea. I don't think there were any parameters that you can pass into the constructor. Honestly, I just have to look at the doc, sorry. As a user, I'm happy to see sign-in with Apple, but as a developer, that's kind of complicated to deal with the business side because you want email. What do you think? So if you need the email, ask for it, right? All they're really saying is if you're not going to make use of the email, then don't ask, right? If your only reason for asking is because that's what you're using as the login, right, to uniquely identify them. You don't need to because Apple will give you an ID. But if you do need to email your users, absolutely ask for it, right? The reality is every app is going to ask for it. They're just really trying to say, only ask for it if you really need it. Unique ID will be the same if user uninstalls and installs again and do sign in again with Apple ID. Yes. So Apple is basically saying every single time you ask us for an ID against your team identifier's app, they will give you that exact same ID, and it won't change. And so even if you uninstall, reinstall, you're still going to get it because as far as Apple is concerned, you're still the same user for that team. But if you go and run, this guy's app on your phone, you're going to get a completely different identifier than you got from my app because we have different team IDs. It's just letting you share within your team if you've got a suite of applications that you use. So, thank you. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Scott.